welcome to Broken Entertainment. So in today's writing video, I want to talk a little bit about using different cultures and different religions and different real-world stuff to kind of inspire what you're writing. A lot of people I've seen, particularly on YouTube, have complained that a lot of fantasy books are written about worlds that are essentially using medieval Europe as a foundation. And they go, well, why can't anyone use, China or India? And there are books out there from those settings as well, but not as many, or perhaps not as widely known. And when I started work on my fantasy novel, I was thinking, okay, I really like medieval Europe. And I want to use knights, and I want to use castles. And I didn't have any intention of saying, yeah, I'm not going to do that, just because a bunch of people on YouTube complain that we don't see other settings enough. But as I was building the world, I started saying, well, there are other things I like too. I like medieval Japan. I like ancient China. Why do I have to use one or the other? We're talking about building a fantasy world, right? Why am I limited in my options? And that seems to me like what always comes up with YouTube and Twitter as well when people talk about it, is an either or scenario. You can have medieval Europe or you can have ancient China. You can't have both. Now, can you mix both in the same culture? Probably not. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But you can have both. I have in my setting, there's the Cyril Commonwealth, which is based on medieval European kingdoms, except that it is a more successful version of what the Holy Roman Empire was trying to do with elected emperors. And I also have some more traditional medieval European feudal kingdoms. I also included tribal peoples. I have underwater mare who live in rivers, not in oceans, and they use the writing system used from South America, because we have all these options to draw on for inspiration. Why are we limiting ourselves to one or the other? So one of the major themes of my fantasy series is balancing extremism, balancing against different types of extremes, where the main character is saying everyone around him is so extreme. Everything is this or it's that. It's black and white. It's men over women. It's women over men. It's this race over that race. And he's kind of inspired more by the ancient past, where things were a little more even. And so I built these different factions, we'll call them, with the idea that they would also balance one against the other. So the Cyril Commonwealth is essentially central medieval Europe in terms of its political systems and its basis. It has knights. It has a significantly powerful church. It has castles. Then we have tribes to the north that are based a little bit more on other native tribes from regions like North America. We have the Mare, who are a combination of a couple of things, and who use a writing system devised primarily in ancient South America. And then you have a couple of smaller traditional feudal Europe kingdoms, and then you have a very large empire to the east that is based on a amalgamation of different Asian traditions. And that's not to say that any of these are those identical things. You're not going to look at one and say that's China, that's the Holy Roman Empire, but every setting is based in a certain sort of mythology, if you want to call it that. And I said, well, why limit myself to one or the other just because that's what people on YouTube say? I don't want to not use medieval stuff, but I also would like to use some stuff from China and Japan and a little bit of Korea. So I think as authors, when we're creating stuff, if you look at especially the differences in those cultural regions are so distinct, they give you a lot to work with. If you look at medieval knights, they're very recognizable. They give you a certain fighting style, a certain battle warfare type. They give you a certain visual. They elicit certain emotions in people. And then if you look at Chinese generals and Chinese warriors in a similar time period, even the swords are completely different. And the visuals are completely different. And the way people behave is completely different. So it gives you a lot to work with. And there's no reason in a fictional world that these things couldn't be close together. In our world, they're far apart. Medieval Europe and ancient China were pretty distant, especially in that time period. So, I guess, it bothers me from the perspective of why are we trying to push everything into one category? Oh, you over there, you have knights and you have a feudal system. Therefore, all you care about is medieval Europe. And you over there, you're more enlightened because that's the way it's always presented, right? Anyone writing medieval Europe-based stuff is somehow a dinosaur, and anyone writing anything that isn't is somehow enlightened. Why limit yourself? Why not take, even if you don't want to use medieval Europe, why not take elements from China and Japan and Korea and Vietnam and India? Because all those things were completely different. Asia is not one monolithic culture. Because to me, there's just this tendency to try to weaponize writing. Right? It's the cancel culture migrating into other things. Because it always starts off by saying, oh, this is more enlightened than that. And then it becomes, if you write medieval Europe, you're racist. Now there's a big push. Well, if you're writing medieval fantasy, why do all your characters have to be white? Well, they don't, of course. I mean, I guess the real question is who's writing medieval Europe-based fantasy that is all white? I don't know. Being the classic example is Tolkien because his world was based on Central Europe, Scandinavia. So, yeah, they're all going to be white. But he was also writing in a different time period. But we can blend this stuff and use it and have it as inspiration and still excite people. And you can still show a lot of interest and get a lot of interest in other cultures by blending them into your work. You don't have to say, oh no, I can't use knights. What if you had Chinese knights? I mean, Chinese knights weren't a thing, but what if you wanted to mix those two things? Why not? It's difficult for me because I get so tired of seeing you have to write in this box and you have to write in that box and you have to write over here. It's getting to the point of you're starting to hear those tales of No, that's not your story to tell. You can't write about a Chinese-based medieval fantasy or epic fantasy because you're not Chinese. Well, of course you can. Just do the research. Give it respect. And it becomes an intentional catch-22. If you write medieval Europe-based fantasy, there's something wrong with you. But if you try to write somebody else's culture, you're appropriating it. Well, maybe you're respecting it. Not to say that somebody can't disrespect a culture, but do the research. Really dig into the cultures and blend them in and come up with something unique. That's what fantasy is all about. Because the real secret, if you want to call it a secret, in my setting, is that you have all these different cultures, but they used to be one. They used to be one huge, diverse empire in which all these different cultures thrived. And that broke down for reasons that will become clear when you read the book. But there's too much tendency. When you see somebody say you need to be thinking about other ways to write, like people need to consider writing in an Asian fantasy, whatever that means, right? Because there is no Asian fantasy. There's Chinese fantasy, there's Indian fantasy, there's Japanese fantasy, there's Iranian fantasy, well, it would be Persian fantasy. Take that consideration and say, yeah, I could draw inspiration from these things. But don't lock yourself into a box. You don't have to write just one aspect. You don't have to write just one thing. If your story is kind of isolated, then yeah, you're going to be kind of locked in. But, a story like mine where there's a lot of traveling, I'm able to take the characters and the readers through all these different places. And if you're talking about epic fantasy, you're talking about a large scale usually. So just some thoughts on this concept of using writing in different, not settings, but cultural backgrounds, we'll call it. And it is something I would like to see more of, but it's something I would like to see more of that isn't just a lockbox of like, you're not this race, therefore you can't write this, or we're tired of medieval European fantasy, therefore it has to be quote-unquote Asian fantasy, which is itself a misnomer. So if you like the video, hit the like button. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.